In supporting Ukraine's brave resistance to Russian aggression, we have a front row seat to the Russian way of war in the 21st century, gaining priceless insights that contribute to our own security.
Yeah, Donald Trump doesn't care about that. According to his friend Gordon Sondland, after he hung up his cell phone in a Ukraine restaurant, just after speaking with Donald Trump, Gordon Sondland said that Donald Trump cares more about investigating Joe Biden than he cares about Ukraine. For a national security and intelligence perspective on today's testimony, we turn now to former CIA Director John Brennan. He is a senior national security and intelligence analyst for MSNBC. And I want to get your reaction to that phone call in that restaurant, which sounds like a very, very high level security risk.
Well, it suggests a number of things. One is that I think, as Neil mentioned, Ambassador Sondland has a fair amount of explaining to do. Number two, it shows that Donald Trump was continually focused on the status of Ukraine's willingness to make a public statement about investigating the Bidens. And three, it shows that Donald Trump will have these open conversations, including to Ukraine, where the Russians have tremendous technical capabilities to tap into those conversations. So I think it just, again, underscores Mr. Trump's failings as President of the United States.
What do other countries watching this today? I was thinking about, obviously, there's intense interest in this hearing in Ukraine. There's intense interest in it in Russia. There's intense interest here. But at a certain point, I started to wonder, what is the rest of the world? What are other governments seeing when they watch this today?
Well, I think other government officials, like the rest of us, have witnessed over the last 2.5 years Mr. Trump's incompetence, his ignorance of foreign affairs, and his inability, in fact, to carry out the duties of the office on the national security front. But the Ukraine matter is different. I think it really reveals Mr. Trump's malfeasance of office and his interest in getting political dirt on his opponents in the upcoming election. And so I think it sends a signal that if you're a foreign leader, I don't think even Mr. Trump has to ask for that information now. I think they know that he is keenly interested in it. He will accept it, and he will give them the appropriate praise as well as maybe compensation as a result. So I think it sends a very bad signal that, unlike any other president, certainly in my memory, this individual, Mr. Trump, is willing to engage in these corrupt political practices, the type of practices that the Foreign Service officers like Mr. Kent and Ambassador Taylor have tried to rid other countries of. And here we are practicing it ourselves.
There's yet another element to this, which I'm going to squeeze in a commercial break and come back after that. And that is that the other thing foreign governments are learning today is that if they did engage in that kind of political help to Donald Trump, Republicans in Congress would protect them and would protect Donald Trump for having, even if caught in that. We'll pick that up when we come back right after this break with John Brennan. We're back with former CIA Director John Brennan, and I wanted to just put up on the screen for the audience a tweet you put out today saying, the impeachment process will reveal whether Republicans will tolerate corruption, dishonesty, and avarice in our nation's highest office. If so, America's political soul and global standing will be indelibly sullied, and Donald Trump will have destroyed the very heart of the GOP. What did you learn about that today?
Well, I guess I've been holding out hope that there will be Republicans of conscience who will do the right thing. But I was very proud of how our diplomats carried out their responsibilities testifying to Congress today. I was embarrassed by the shameful performance of the Republicans, who seem to have no interest in uncovering the truth and doing what is right and consistent with American values and principles. And so it seems as though they're going to continue to circle the wagons, and they're going to defend Mr. Trump at all costs. And they have decided to jump into the cesspool of politics with him, with their dishonesty. And it really is quite unfortunate that they've decided to go down this road. I really believe that if these Republican members of Congress were in office in 1974, Richard Nixon never would have been removed from office. He never would have been shown the door, basically, by the Republicans. And I'm still hoping that Republicans in Congress, in the Senate and the House, are going to rise to the occasion. But I'm losing hope and faith in them.
Former CIA Director John Brennan, thank you very much for joining us tonight. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.